Science South Asia at the Graduate School of Muslim Cultures and Societies at Free University Berlin since 2008. Since 2011, he is academic advisor of the World Economic Forum Davos for South Asia, attending the Global Agenda Council on Pakistan 2011-2014 and India Economic Summits. So I would like to request, please, Professor to come on dais and enlighten with his talk.
Dear friends and colleagues, मैं बहुत खुशगुजार हूँ कि मुझे आपके दावत मिल गया आपसे खिताब करने के लिए but I have not prepared a paper because the connection with the organizers happened rather late. So in that sense, I will be making just a few remarks from an academic's point of view as some sort of comment how we can deal or how we could reflect on some of the topics that have been discussed during these 2 days. The first question, which in that sense as an academic one is always troubled or worried about, is what is actually the status of history and the status of historic truth. And here since that is a largely also student community that is participating here, I would always emphasize in discussions that one should never forget the relativity of the history that is written, because any history is a selection process, because we do not know and we cannot access the totality of data of what actually happened in the past. So whoever has written history has already made a selection. In that sense, it is very important to keep engaged with this selection process and to reflect on it and to discuss it and to be part of this engagement in a very active way, and not to take history and historic reflections as truth in themselves. But they will always speak often more about the historian than about the era in which the events happened and which is being discussed. I had been asked to also give some brief comments about partition, which however is not really the topic of my research. I basically engaged with history of the late colonial period through my book Islam in the Public Sphere, where I try to understand to what extent Muslim groups and Islamic actors pursued an Islamic project of their own for independence. This was not necessarily about partition, but primarily about the parameters of society and governance under conditions of independence. And here I would argue that this concern has remained relevant until the current era as well. What do and can the parameters of Islam and Muslim society say for the rule of society and for its governance, and how can people shape their lives, and how can people engage with these traditions to improve the condition of the larger society, to have an impact on the transformation and to improve lives. At the same time, my understanding of partition is also influenced by my other, so to say, second perspective as a political scientist of international relations who has studied the transformation of international relations with regard to South Asia. And in that sense, the partition of the subcontinent was also part of a wider transformation of the global order, marked by both decolonization, but also, not to forget, the emergence of a new global order, at that time largely anti-communist global order after the Second World War. In that sense, the partition was not just about the creation of a homeland for South Asian Muslims as the product of Muslim nationalism. It was also about the involvement of big powers and the creation of new post-war global alliances, where Pakistan was quickly drawn into the pro-US anti-Soviet orbit and India into the other camp. There still is a large legacy of those conflicts, several of which remain unresolved until today, be they Palestine, Kashmir, or even in some way the South China Sea. Why I'm mentioning it, that we cannot forget about this historical legacy, and that there is a continuing need perhaps to engage with political realism to basically find approaches and find ways how these solutions after such a long gap could finally be achieved, and how these international or historical events intertwined with the internal political situation could be even seen in that particular connection. For instance, there was one perhaps singular moment when the Kashmir conflict between Pakistan and India to some extent could have been solved in Agra, when there were already an agreement which, however, somehow could not materialize because of some resistance from, as Indian media reported, the BJP party and the BJP leadership. So that shows already an ambivalence that is even critical and important today, that the external contestation is used for internal political purposes and therefore becomes intertwined and seems to be very difficult to disengage from it. That is as much true for India as it is for Pakistan. Just right now, when the talks between India and Pakistan were cancelled, most observers argue that this has actually nothing to do with Pakistan, but this has all to do with Indian politics. And it is also quite, I think, relevant and important today to remember the ambivalence of the partition process itself until today. As you well know, until very late in the process, Jinnah and the Muslim League were still ready to form a coalition with the Congress party, provided they get the concessions they wanted. And there are many historians who would still argue that, in a sense, both parties contributed to the events as they developed. Does that make it right or wrong, the process? No, it does not, because it is a fact of history and people's lives were affected, and they are affected on both sides, and they have to engage with these conditions under which their lives are being conducted at present. And Jinnah also pointedly, that's also quite interesting, carried the spirit of secularism right into the creation of Pakistan, where he commanded to give equal rights to all religious communities, which until today politicians in Pakistan, right under the new government of Imran Khan, are still struggling to claim and implement. But secularism in India has also faced challenges for the Muslim community, both from a national political contestation and from inside the community itself, when contestations about Muslim identity are still continuing, and when sectarian tension in South Asia are particularly strong, something which I, as an academic specialist on South Asian Islam in Europe, always have to explain in detail, because they are little understood in other parts of the world. Cultural and religious identities continue to be mobilized for political and economic purposes. They have served to preserve and create a system of quotas and preferential treatment, both in politics and social systems. From an outside perspective, which I have as an observer, it is not clear if this will ultimately solve the question of marginalization. Parallel to this process, all communities go through the same social differentiation. In every community, there are groups with a higher income and groups who are poor. It is here where education and inclusion, from a perspective of a political scientist, would come strongly into play. In a way, it is a long-term consequence of partition that the fate and success of the Muslim community in India will heavily depend on education and inclusion, both within the parameters of the Indian state and within its own community, I would argue. Education and inclusion will therefore be important trajectories which offer a huge field for civic engagement. In a way, this connects with my research on various Muslim groups from South Asia, which I've tried to understand beyond their religious identity, also as social and global actors. You are perhaps aware that it is a, to some extent, unique feature for Muslim groups from South Asia, that such as the Tablighi or the Deobandi, but also the Barelvi and even the Ahmadiyya and even secular Muslims in an organized way, that they all have a global and trans-regional outreach. And yet, from the perspective of the larger Islamic world, they are sometimes seen as operating on the margin of Islam, because there to refashion and re-understand potential arguments, but a process that is primarily driven by also social, cultural, religious, and historical developments, and that is as much being proceeding from the so-called global south as from the global north. It is on these words marking our current stage of transformation, where I would also argue that people should not be drawn into this polarization that we are currently facing, but the polarization should be a reason, or should be an argument to reach out to the other communities. And that's important for academics, because if you want to understand the condition of society, one of the many things that I always try to explain to the students, try to change perspective. How does the same situation look through the eyes of the discriminated parts of the other communities, of the Hindus, of the Christians, of other non-Muslims, and even among the Muslims, of the Barelvis, of the Ahmadis, of anybody else? Try to switch perspective to understand the larger picture in which you are operating, and in which you need to understand. And it is on these words that I wish all the students great success in their intellectual endeavors, and hope to see a lot of your publications in future. Thank you.